Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hall. Today we're talking about The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman. If you have not watched the first presentation, please make sure that you do, because not only do I give a little bit of a bio on the author, talk about some of his influences, I also give an overview of the book itself and kind of some major plot points and some major characters. So now we're going to get into an analysis of the book. It is really complex and interesting, even though it's a little bit shorter. I think that there's a lot there. It's one of the reasons that I chose it for you, obviously. I'm really excited to share it with you guys. So the narrative style. Today, if you are a big reader, you're going to right away notice a difference with how this book is written. Like I said, it's short. It moves along very quickly, in my opinion. Most books today have a narrative style where the author shows you things about a character rather than just telling you directly. So, for example, instead of saying Mr. Monroe was a mean man, an author might depict a scene in which Mr. Monroe has a confrontation with his neighbor's child. There would be dialogue, description of the two characters. You'd be able to see the entire scene play out, and the narrator basically would be showing you that Mr. Monroe is mean and probably bitter, right? Instead of telling you directly. So one of the things that happens in this book is that it's the opposite. It relies mostly on telling. Through a lot of the book, the narrator tells you how characters feel and what happens, but he does not fully describe each scene in detail or show what the characters are doing or saying. So, for example, a lot of time passes in like a paragraph where it'll say something like, Emma Lou worked for so-and-so for a while, and then she became dissatisfied and she decided to leave. And then also she went to her landlady, and her landlady was angry at her for having men over, and so she left, right? But it doesn't show you the scenes fully of any of those things taking place. So it's a little bit interesting, stylistically speaking. Yeah, here are some complaints and feedback people get when they're authors. Common feedback for overtellers that, I'll zoom in here. There we go. There wasn't enough dialogue. Your story felt rushed. I didn't get to know your characters well. I couldn't picture the setting. The story feels like an outline. I don't think it's predictable. But I think that some of that, if you, some of this, if you feel that as you're reading, don't be surprised. Know also, though, again, we've talked about this through a lot of the units. This is the Harlem Renaissance, also part of the Lost Generation, and the writers in this movement of the Harlem Renaissance are trying to be experimental and do things in a different way. So the narrative style, I think, is very deliberate, and it is rushed. You don't get to know most of the characters, but to be honest, neither does Emma Lou. And so it's very important that you see the way that she sees life and the way that she goes through life. And she doesn't, a lot of times it'll say about a character, she didn't know his name, he was supple and dark-skinned, or he was a good-looking, light-skinned man with muscles, and that's it. A lot of people here are defined by their skin color because Emma Lou is very, what they call in the book, color conscious. And colorism, is, as I said in the last presentation, really the dominant theme in this book. So this kind of ties in with the point of view. Through most of the book, the author is using what's called a limited third-person point of view. So here's an example. He looked off into the mountains. He remembered the time he'd been there last, right? It's focusing mostly on one person and following them throughout the story. So for most of the book, you know what Emma Lou knows. Then, in some situations, describing what she's thinking and feeling, her perspective is very skewed. She's not telling the story. It's not first person. I felt this, I think that. But it is almost like an unreliable narrator because she sometimes perceives things that are not happening. and other times she doesn't perceive things that are happening right in front of her. So, for example, she'll think that a man is not interested in her when maybe he is. Or she will not perceive that someone is mistreating her. Or she thinks that somebody is mistreating her and she gets very on her high horse about it, but it's really not happening. So sometimes there's legitimate discrimination and prejudice, and other times there isn't. As I said, we don't get a lot of information about the other characters, but when the point of view shifts to be a little more omniscient third person means that the author is showing what all the characters think and what they say and what they do. This only happens a few times, so you really need to pay attention to what the other characters are thinking, particularly Alva, and how that is so much different from what Emalu thinks. And how her perception of events is completely different from possibly what's actually going on. And I think it's really masterful use of narrative point of view, because he dips into it and widens that scope, pulls back the camera to show you what's going on only a couple of times for very specific purposes. So yeah, definitely take that into account. A lot of the beginning part as well is just about the setting, which is going to be important too. So colorism, what exactly is it? I've mentioned it a couple times. Colorism basically is prejudice and discrimination based on skin color. So we have this image here. Why don't you do something with your hair versus why don't you have your natural hair? I don't see you as black. Where are you from? It's that kind of thing. There can be groups within a group. Colorism can happen within a group, meaning that if you have, say, a city that's predominantly African American, it could be prejudice against people with darker skin color. It can also be between groups. Basically, there are a number of different groups, and people are kind of put into different stratas based on their skin color. So perceived as darker skinned are discriminated against because of that. So the book, we basically see this applied to beauty standards, dating, education, the workplace, family relationships, and basically the definition of racism is that it's like institutionalized prejudice, right? If you've heard that term before. And anybody can be prejudiced, but racism really has to do with systems that are set up to oppress people based on their race, right? And that means like government and educational institutions, all of that kind of thing. So we really see, like racism, colorism in this book. It's very clear that this is also an institutionalized problem, that you have sororities and fraternities that are letting people in or not based on how dark or light they are. You have people who will not hire someone who is of a darker complexion. All of that kind of thing. It's very pervasive throughout the society in the book. So Emalu, basically her upbringing causes her to hate herself. She gets these messages about how she's not pretty, about how she's ugly, she's too dark from a very young age. The author spends a lot of time on this in the beginning of the book to set you up to understand why she makes the choices that she makes later on. And basically, it's internalized racism. And it's showing how pervasive white supremacy was in American society, especially at that time and in particular places. So we start in Idaho in the 1920s. According to census data, just a little bit of historical info here, Idaho was about 70% white in 1870. And by the time we get to 1920, it's almost 100% white. It's about 99% white. So why is this? Well, you had a large population of Chinese immigrants in the area. and they were kind of driven out through institutionalized racism and the type of laws that are similar to Jim Crow laws. There were reservations for Native Americans. Some of them were established, and some were basically forcing Native Americans from their land onto these reservations. And also have a lot of the African American population dropping because of this environment, and they left during the Great Migration. And we've talked about that before, but the Great Migration is large numbers of African Americans moving from rural areas in the West, Midwest, and South, and coming to more urban centers, mostly in the Midwest and the North especially. So Detroit, Chicago, New York, Harlem, obviously. So in the 1920s and 30s, in addition to all of this, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, was extremely active. And I'm going to show a picture in a moment. There were over 13 chapters in Idaho. Now, a chapter is basically like a large group that could cover a number of cities. Idaho is pretty rural. So this is a very pervasive problem in this state. And moreover, they were supported by powerful politicians. So here is them without their hoods on, which you can see that they're not afraid to take the hoods up and show their faces. Group of officials in their uniforms minus mask snapped at the state Klan cave in the state fairgrounds Monday afternoon. That is directly from a newspaper at the time. They're meeting at the state fairgrounds. I don't know if you guys have ever been to a state fairgrounds, but it's a very large place, right? And it's just... So there are powerful politicians, and they're attempting to block anti-lynching legislation. That was one of the big questions at the time in the state, that Black people, particularly Black men, some of whom had been lynched, and there were no laws against it. And politicians who were also either in the KKK or getting money from them or supporting them secretly, basically were blocking legislation that would make this legal. So it's a horrifying piece of history, but I want to say that we don't see any of this in the book. There are only a few very brief mentions of white characters. We don't hear about any of the politics or the world events going on at the time. But this is the world that Emma Lou and her family are living in. So it's kind of like silently and pervasively in the background, this idea of white supremacy, that white people are supreme over other races, right? That's basically what that means. And because of that, it affects and warps how the community of African Americans that she grows up in, how they view themselves, and by extension, how they view Emma Lou. So here is the same kind of problem today. Colorism reveals many shades of prejudice in Hollywood. This is from the Associated Press, meaning that it's basically like a group of reporters. But anyway, so this is written just last year. For African Americans, bias toward lighter-skinned peoples dates back to slavery. Skin complexion sometimes determined what type of jobs slaves were assigned, or if post-slavery, they were worthy of receiving an education. In later decades, universities, fraternities, and other institutions were known for using the brown paper bag test. Those with skin lighter than the bag were in. It's part of white supremacy or holding up whiteness over other backgrounds, Robinson said. It has deep implications, historical implications in the Black community, from beauty standards to professional opportunities to how families have treated one another. The problem also exists in the music industry. Matthew Knowles, who managed daughters Beyonce and Solange and Destiny's Child, said it's no accident that most of the recent top-selling Black artists are lighter-skinned, like Mariah Carey and Rihanna. He said Beyonce often got opportunities that darker-skinned artists probably wouldn't. So I bring this up because, number one, this is exactly what's happening in the book. It's holding up white supremacy and whiteness over backgrounds. We see Emmylou's family kind of bragging that they must have been more beautiful because the white slave owners decided to use them basically to mate with them, or have relationships with them, is sort of how they put it. And that because of that, they have more white blood in their systems, and because of that, they're lighter skinned. And it's really, as Robinson says here, really part of white supremacy and deep implications. The beauty standards in this book, the professional opportunities that Emma has or does not have, how she's treated by the university, how she's treated by the sorority, all of that kind of thing really comes down, a lot of it comes down to her complexion and the color of her skin. And sadly, it's still going on today. We just had a movie came out that Lin-Manuel Miranda did, and it was criticized for picturing an Afro-Latino community that really only had lighter complexion people in the film. And there have been many other actresses. Viola Davis has darker complexion, and she's talked about how hard she had to fight for some of the roles and how she didn't get them because she was darker. So it really kind of is just an extension of racism, and it's upsetting that it's still happening today, but it's even more prevalent in this book. And as I said, it's really the dominant theme. So this is an excerpt from, I think, page 2 or 3. More acutely than ever before, Emmylou began to feel that her luscious black complexion was somewhat of a liability, and that her marked color variation from the other people in her environment was a decided curse. Not that she minded being black. Being a Negro necessitated having a colored skin, but she did mind being too black. So you can see how this is right after she's given some messages about how her father was too dark and how now she's too dark, and because of that, she's not pretty. And before that, she didn't really think about the color of her skin, and then she starts to. And this is like the seed that plants a tree that's going to just disrupt her whole life. So it really shows that the black beauty standards have been influenced by whites in America. Emma's family have blue veins. They believe that they're better than others because they're lighter skinned and of mixed race. At some points, they brag about their ancestors being used by slave owners, causing them to be what in the book is referred to mulatto or high yellow. Those are the terms that would be used. Now we would just say that somebody is of mixed race, right? They denigrate Emmylou and her father because of the color of their skin. And these thoughts, as I said, they stay with her throughout the book. So I really want you to see racism is something that's learned. And so is colorism. And so is internalized hatred. Children don't come up just hating other people who are different color than them or different race than them, right? And when you're giving people these messages, they start internalizing the racism sometimes. Now, I will say that one of the criticisms of this book is that Thurman sometimes doesn't fully get the female perspective. That's what people have said. And that many people have said that Emmylou, being a woman, would not have reacted certain ways in certain situations. But I actually think that he captures it quite well. But that'll be something for you guys to talk about. Other things to consider. This is something I brought up last time. This is a quote from the book. Negroes must always be sober and serious in order to impress white people with their adaptability and non-difference in all salient characteristics, save skin color. This is something that Emmylou thinks, and something that the author, Wallace Thurman, was vehemently opposed to. He did not think that you had to be sober and serious or impress white people. What would be the point of that? Why bother? Other people at the time were saying, like, yeah, adapt and blend in and be exactly the same and basically try to assimilate and try to be white even though you have a darker skin. So there's a lot in this book about black respectability, and a lot here that other people at the time would have really objected to, because he's showing, as many other writers of, I'll get my pen out here, the Lost Generation, the seedier side of life, toxic relationships, alcoholism, dancing, rent parties. All of these kind of things are in this book. But guess what? They're also, if you took my class on the Lost Generation, they're also in a lot of the other writings of this time. So the difference is that the characters here are black. That's it. Everybody in these books is having affairs and drinking and having bad toxic relationships, right? A couple other things I want you to note. Emma Lou sometimes really comes off as unlikable. There's no real antagonist here because the antagonist is just the racist culture that she's living in. But she's kind of an anti-hero instead of a hero. She's the protagonist, she's the main character, but I would not call her necessarily the hero or the heroine of this story. She makes a lot of questionable choices. She's quite mean to people at times, all of that. It is, however, a coming of age story, and I do want you to notice, especially the last third of the novel, how her begins to change as she matures, as she becomes really a woman. Through most of this, she is a very young woman, right? Very like early 20s. So as she takes time and comes into herself, her ideas do start to change. And particularly toward the end, she's able to make some different decisions that she definitely would never have made in the beginning. So I want you to see this kind of as a coming of age book of sorts. Certainly not a young adult novel, but she does come of age. She does have an eye-opening spiritual kind of awakening, or at least a better in-depth look at herself and who she is and what she deserves. There is a lot setting, especially in Boise. We get a little bit about California, and then we get a little bit about Harlem. As I said, Black respectability. There are some themes here about school and education, and at one point there is a scene involving homosexuality, and we talked about the author and his life and how he kind of struggled with sexuality through part of it and tried to kind of cover it up and things like that. So that's something to look for as well, because I think that what happens there and how it's depicted is kind of interesting. And I would ask whether the author also had some kind of internalized hatred for his identity and who he was, which is kind of sad to see given the themes that he's trying to convey through the rest of the book. So it's a shorter book. I think that sometimes there can be some repetition. Sometimes, as I said, the point of view moves things along really quickly. But I think that if you take the time to really read it and dig into it and think about what the author's message is, it's a really powerful novel and definitely worth reading. And I can't wait to see your thoughts on it. Thanks, everyone.